Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are going to be ranking Pokémon games. And here's how it's going to work, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to take each Pokemon game and give it a score between 1 to 10 in 4 key categories. On a side note, there are a lot of Pokemon games now. That took me like 45 minutes to edit and it really wasn't worth it. But whatever, it's staying in the video, because I'm not letting all that time go to waste. Firstly, we've got storyline, which is pretty straightforward. If I like the story, it's gonna get a high score. If I don't like the story, well, it's probably not going to do too well in this category. Next up, we've got gameplay, which looks at the overall playability of the game. And this includes mechanics and features that are available in the game, and just giving an overall score on those things. The next category is art style, which basically considers the visual appeal of the game. It's essentially just a vibe check on the game, guys. I'll consider the art design, the graphics, and that's basically it for this category. I'll just kind of, have a glance at the game and just form a vibe on the art, and we'll just slap a score on it for that. And then lastly, we have got arguably the most important aspect of a Pokemon game, which is the Pokemon themselves. So what I'll do is I'll just give an overall score of the quality of the Pokemon that are available in the game. And then what we'll do is we'll tally up the overall score for each game and chuck them on a leaderboard and see which game comes out on top. But before we get into that, I just wanted to say, guys, what the f***? 95% of you who are watching my videos are not subscribed, and this hurts my feelings, and I think it's bullshit, so you should hit that subscribe button. Anyways, let's get into it. Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow. I'm just gonna clump them all together because they're the same f***ing game, pretty much. There's a few differences, I know, but guys, come on, give me a break here. Alright, storyline. 6 out of 10. I think the storyline in Gen 1's pretty simple, but it sets a solid foundation for Pokemon games. It's basically just, become the champion, beat Team Rocket, catch a few mons here and there, and that's all it really needs to do. So I think it gets a solid 6 out of 10, because it's iconic, but it does lack a lot of depth and complexity, which are found in the later generations. Gameplay. 8 out of 10. Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow are pretty much masterpieces for gameplay considering the time they came out in. And whilst there's a lot of glitches and stuff, the core mechanics of a Pokemon game were pretty much all established in Generation 1. Next up for art style, these ones get a 4 out of 10 because everything looks gross and disgusting in that old Game Boy art style. I hate how pixelated it all is, the sprites lack detail, but I will say they do have a little bit of charm with them as well, but it just doesn't really appeal to me. So whilst I understand that it may resonate with a lot of other people, for me, not so much, so it gets a 4 out of 10. And finally, for Pokemon design, Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow get a 10 out of 10 because, hey, it introduced the first generation of Pokemon, which is arguably still the most memorable to this day. You got Pokemon like Pikachu, Charizard, and Mewtwo in here, which are, basically cultural phenomena at this point, so I think it would be rude not to give it a 10 out of 10 for Pokemon design. And with that means that Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow get a total score of 28. Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal. And before you guys throw a tantrum, yes, I'm including Crystal with Gold and Silver because whilst there are a few differences, it's just not enough for me to make its own separate section in the video. Come on, guys. Come on now, that would just be stupid. Imagine if I just did Gold and Silver and then spent another 3 minutes talking about Pokemon Crystal. Oh my god. Anyways, moving on. For storyline, Gold, Silver, and Crystal get a 6 out of 10. And that's because whilst the storyline in these games did build upon the foundation of Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow, it still follows the same beats. It's just, you know, get the gym badges, beat the Elite Four, and then you go to another region and rinse and repeat. It is a, you know, it's a longer story, but I don't think that necessarily makes it a better story. I do think it's really awesome that you can go back and revisit the Kanto region though, but nonetheless, it's going to get the same score as the Generation 1 games at a 6 out of 10. Gameplay gets a 9 out of 10, and that's because these games added a lot of new mechanics which have pretty much become mainstays in Pokemon games going forward, and this includes the introduction of held items for Pokemon, you've got breeding, you've got shiny Pokemon which are introduced in this generation, and you've also got the day-night time system as well, which was, you know, whilst I don't consider it the most important feature, it's there, so I thought I'd bring it up. So overall, I think the addition of all of these features really did make some massive enhancements to the gameplay, and that's why it gets a 9 out of 10. Art style, 7 out of 10. And that's because whilst there still is a massive improvement on the art style from Gen 1, with now color in the game, and I think the sprites in Pokemon Crystal were animated as well. It does add to the art style, but I still feel like the overall vibe of the art style is very reminiscent to Generation 1. It's basically just Generation 1 with color, so I can't really differentiate it too much. So it gets a 7 out of 10 because obviously having color is a massive plus there, so that does bump it up a little bit. And for Pokemon design, I'm giving it a 9 out of 10 because they've got this guy and that guy and that guy, which I think are all pretty chill dudes, so that's why it gets a 9 out of 10. So overall, Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal get a score of 31, which places them at the top of the list. Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Storyline gets a 7 out of 10 because whilst it is a little bit more complex with the 2 different teams, that's right guys, we went from 1 to 2, when you break down this story, it really doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to go into too much detail on it, but both Team Aqua and Team Magma are absolute silly billies. They have no idea what they're doing, and their actions in the game really don't make a lot of sense. So whilst they did, you know, introduce some new beats to the storyline, it severely lacks depth and sense. Gameplay gets an 8 out of 10 because there's abilities and natures now, which I think are pretty amazing things to add into Pokemon, and especially for competitive battling. Those 2 things alone, abilities and natures, are just amazing additions to Pokemon games. Moving on to art style, it gets a 10 out of 10 because I'm a nostalgic little I grew up with these games and I absolutely love the GBA Pokemon game art styles and the music as well, which I just realized is something I haven't talked about in this whole video yet. I guess the music in Gen 1 and Gen 2 don't really stand out to me like Gen 3 does, which is why I just thought of the music then. So for those reasons, art style gets a 10 out of 10. Pokemon design, 10 out of 10 as well. I absolutely love the Gen 3 Pokemon. I love this guy, I like that guy, and most importantly, I love that guy. So I feel like that really does justify the 10 out of 10 score. So overall, Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald get a total score of 35, which places them on top of the leaderboard. I was just about to go into Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, but I've decided I'm not going to include the remakes because it just feels really repetitive. Essentially what I did was I gave the storyline pretty much the same as Gen 1 because it's literally a remake, and then I copied the gameplay and the art style from Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald because they're part of the same generation and they are very, very similar, and obviously they have pretty much the same features and mechanics. And then for the Pokemon design category, again, I just copied Gen 1, so it just kind of felt like a bit of a redundant thing to do. So from now on, I'm skipping all remakes, alright? Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum. Starting off with storyline, we're giving them a 9 out of 10 because whilst Team Galactic make no sense, in a similar way to how Team Magma and Team Aqua don't really make much sense, I do find the overall narrative with what they're trying to do to be a bit more compelling and interesting to play through. So for that reason, I think it's definitely the best storyline out of all the Pokemon games we've talked about so far, so it does get a 9 out of 10. For gameplay, they only get a 6 out of 10, and that's because, after looking into it a bit more deeply, the additions that were made into this game, I really don't think were anywhere near as compelling as what the previous generations had provided us. I think the biggest thing was probably the physical special split with Pokemon moves, but again, to the average player, that really doesn't matter at all. And as well as that, obviously these games were the first Pokemon games to be released on a dual screen handheld, so you do have a few features that take advantage of the bottom screen, but overall I don't think any of them are that crazy, so yeah, it's just gonna get a 6 out of 10 there. For art style, I'm giving Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum a 10 out of 10. I really do love the graphics in these games. They just look so nice. As you can tell, I'm really not great at talking about and describing art, but it just appeals to me a lot, and that's all I can really say about it. And as well as that, the music in these games are definitely up there with the best in the series. So for that reason, I'm giving Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum a 10 out of 10. Pokemon design, they get a 7 out of 10. There's a few cool ones like this guy, and that guy, but there's also a few weird ones like that guy, so they get a 7 out of 10. And with that, Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum get a total score of 32. Pokemon Black and White and Black and White 2. Now some of you might be wondering why I'm including them all together, because they are separate games with separate stories, unlike previous generations, but the reason for that is pretty simple. The storyline for both Black and White and Black 2 and White 2 get a 10 out of 10. They're just absolute bangers, guys. Team Plasma are the boys. It's a much more complex narrative in both games, which is what this series desperately needed, and explored some pretty deep themes throughout the process, with a lot of the main characters actually going through arcs and receiving a lot of growth and depth, which was something that was just completely unheard of in Pokemon games before Generation 5. So they're both getting a 10 out of 10 for storyline, despite them having different storylines, as one is a sequel to the other. So for gameplay, Pokemon Black and White and Black and White 2 get a 6 out of 10. The main reason for this is because, just like in Generation 4, there wasn't too much added to the game that really enhanced the experience. I feel like the biggest thing was probably the introduction of fully animated Pokemon sprites in battles, which, don't get me wrong, is absolutely amazing. But some of the other features like the Dream World, triple battles, and I'm struggling to think of other stuff. Feel free to comment that down below. But nonetheless, a lot of those other features just don't feel as important to the series as with previous generations. Moving on to art style, these games get a 10 out of 10. I think considering that both of these games came out on the Nintendo DS, the art style is absolutely amazing and really pushes the system to its greatest potential, really. I don't think I've seen any Nintendo DS games that look any better than these. And for Pokemon design, they get a 5 out of 10 because what is that? What is that? And most importantly, what is that? So yeah. With that being said, there are still a lot of really nice designs in there, but I just feel like there's a lot more really bad ones compared to previous games. So with that, Pokemon Black and White and Black and White 2 get a total score of 31. Pokemon X and Y. Storyline, 4 out of 10. It's just such a bland story. You definitely don't play Pokemon X and Y for the story. I can tell you that much for free. With that being said though, there is some cool aspects to it, like its focus on Mega Evolution in the story. But overall, all of the characters just feel so bland and one-dimensional in this game. There really isn't too much to digest, and as well as that, Team Flare are just a bunch of goofballs. They're all so silly and stupid, even more so than Team Magma and Team Aqua. They're just a bunch of goofballs. They were definitely the worst evil team in a Pokemon game to this point, so yeah. Sorry, Pokemon X and Y. Gameplay gets a 10 out of 10, and that is because it's the first Pokemon tile to be fully presented in 3D graphics, which is something that every Pokemon fan was dying for at the time that these came out. They just look so good. And alongside this, the addition of Mega Evolutions and the Fairy typing are both massive additions to the game, which made the games feel very fresh overall and exciting to play. Moving on to art style, Pokemon X and Y get a 9 out of 10. The move to 3D brought beautiful graphics to the series. Some of the cutscenes, some of the environments that you explore in the game just look very immersive and visually appealing to me. So for that reason, the games get a 9 out of 10. And for Pokemon design, Pokemon X and Y get a 7 out of 10. I think there's a lot more stunning and creative Pokemon designs than there is bad ones in this generation, but there are definitely a few absolute stinkers out there, so I just thought I'd balance it out at a 7 out of 10 for this generation. And with that, Pokemon X and Y get a total score of 30, which isn't too bad. Next up, we've got Pokemon Sun and Moon and Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. And look, I kind of despise this generation a lot, so apologies if this is a bit harsh, but for storyline, these games get a 4 out of 10. I just really didn't like the trial system in this game and kind of the way it played into the story. It just felt weird. I don't know. It's been so long since I've played these as well, so perhaps this is a little bit too harsh here, but storyline gets a 4 out of 10. I can barely even remember them, to be honest. Whoops. Moving on to gameplay, they get a 6 out of 10. As I just mentioned, the removal of gyms kind of sucks. In terms of new features added into the game, I'm trying to think. I don't think there's too much that they added that was super crazy. There was the Rotom bottom screen, but that really isn't too different from previous entries to the series. And there was Z-Move, which I really didn't like as well, so there really isn't too much there to talk about in terms of new features for these ones. For the art style, I'm going to give Pokemon Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon an 8 out of 10. Whilst technically the graphical quality did improve upon the previous generation, I actually greatly prefer the art style of Pokemon X and Y versus Pokemon Sun and Moon. When you compare them side by side, they don't look too different, but I think the character models and the color schemes of both games give very different vibes to me. I'm so bad at describing the art style category, but I hope you guys can kind of understand what I'm trying to say there. I guess a better way of putting it was that Pokemon Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon felt a little bit less vibrant to me versus Pokemon X and Y, but they were still technically a lot more higher graphical quality. That's what I'm trying to say. For Pokemon design, Pokemon Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon get a 6 out of 10. I think they only introduced something like 80 new Pokemon in this generation, so it was a bit underwhelming in that sense, but that was also counteracted by a lot of new Alolan forms of Pokemon that were introduced as well. So there were a lot of great Pokemon that came out in this generation, like that dude and this guy, but then there's also that guy and that dude, so yeah. So with that, Pokemon Sun and Moon and Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon get a total score of 24. Yikes. Pokemon Sword and Shield. The storyline gets a 4 out of 10. It's boring and really underdeveloped. I think this game has probably the most bizarre plot because you as the main character aren't really the main character in this game until the very end. In a sense, throughout the majority of the game, you're just beating gyms whilst the actual story is happening off to the side in which you have no involvement with. And then at the very end of the game, once you beat Leon and become champion, that's when you as the main character actually become the main character. It's weird like that. I won't say too much more about it, but it's a very lacking storyline in my opinion. Gameplay gets a 7 out of 10, and that's because it added a lot of pretty cool ideas such as Dynamax, raids, it brought back gyms, thank god, and it also has a fully open world area, which was a really big thing for Pokemon as well, especially with Pokemon Sword and Shield being the first Pokemon games to come to the Switch. I will say though that whilst these features were pretty cool, none of them are really series defining in any way, shape or form, so that's why it just gets a 7 out of 10. For art style, these games get a 9 out of 10, and that's just because having the HD graphics on a Pokemon game is simply visually amazing for the series, which had been on handhelds for every single other main series entry since the very beginning. And I think the wild area really showcased the capabilities of this going forward, but didn't fully take advantage of it as well. Moving on to Pokemon design, I'm gonna give it a 6 out of 10. I don't know, none of these really vibe with me, especially this guy. So with that, Pokemon Sword and Shield get a total score of 26. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. The storyline gets a 10 out of 10, no questions asked. I think this game has the coolest story of any Pokemon game so far, particularly when you make it down to Area Zero. I just think there's some twists in this game that I really didn't expect, and it's also pretty deep as well. The characters are all very strong. It's a really good storyline for a Pokemon game. Gameplay gets a 7 out of 10. Now, this one was a hard one for me to judge because this game has got a lot of amazing features. Firstly, it's fully open world. There's no set order in which you need to defeat the gyms, defeat Team Star, or find the 5 legendary Herba Mystica things as well. You can choose to play this adventure in any way you want, which I found really awesome. But on the downside, this game also has a lot of problems. For example, it's the first game where I've had to bring up lag as a big problem, because that is a major issue with this game. Some of the character models, when they're off in the distance, move at like 2 frames per second. It's absolutely awful in that sense. But those things have been talked about more than enough in relation to Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. I do think that it is the first Pokemon game in a while to really expand on the Pokemon formula, which I do respect a lot. For art style, these games get a 10 out of 10 as well. I think it's hard because I'm comparing a game on the Nintendo Switch to games that were previously on Nintendo DS's and Game Boys, but it's just a beautiful game, like it really is, and especially the music as well. I think it's the Area Zero music, which was just really awesome in this game to me. And for Pokemon design, I'm giving Pokemon Scarlet and Violet a 7 out of 10. Like a lot of recent generations, there are a few really cool Pokemon like this one, and then there's a few like that one and that one, so gets a 7 out of 10, which brings Pokemon Scarlet to a total score of 34. And that means that Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald win with a total score of 35. This is definitely not a biased list, since those were the games I grew up with, I promise you guys. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.